And joining us now on the line from the nation's capital, Michael Petrou, author of the newly released Renegades, Canadians in the Spanish Civil War. Michael, how are you tonight?
Good, Steve. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. I'm glad you're on the line from Ottawa with us. You know, my suspicion is that there are people of a certain generation who, when you mention the Spanish Civil War, know exactly what we're talking about. But I got a hunch that many of our younger viewers will not know about this chapter in world history. So let's just, for starters, start from scratch. This was a civil war between whom and whom?
Yeah, the war happened in the 1930s, and we really have to cast our mind back. It was a different era. It was a time when the world was very much divided between the left and the right. Benito Mussolini was ruling Italy, of course, and Hitler was in power in Germany. Stalin was in power in the Soviet Union, and so the world was divided. And then in Spain, several right-wing generals launched an attempted coup d'etat against what had been a democratically elected left-leaning government, the Spanish Republic. So one of the main generals that was leading this revolt was Francisco Franco, and he started his revolt in Spanish Morocco, Spain's colonial holdings in North Africa, with the support right off the bat of Adolf Hitler, who helped him bring his soldiers across the Strait of Gibraltar to mainland Spain. So he and his co-conspirators were hoping for an easy victory. But what happened is a lot of the Spanish public, a lot of Spanish citizens, they stayed loyal to their government, and they took up arms, and after a few days the Spanish government armed the workers and armed a lot of the unions. So what Franco and his co-rebels had hoped would be a very quick and easy victory turned into a civil war with the country more or less evenly divided between Franco, these were the nationalists, the rebels, and the Spanish Republicans, or the government. These were the loyalists.
Well, in fact, let me jump in here because we've got a map that demonstrates how the country was in fact split. Michael, if we can, let's put this up. Here's how Spain was divided on the eve of the war. This is 1936 in the summer. The Republicans controlled the middle of the country from Madrid over to Barcelona, and then that thin strip in the north as well near the French border. But the fascists under Franco controlled the northwest and the southwest of the country, and as Michael just suggested, that part of Spanish Morocco as well. Now, what was the I guess the spark that lit the fuse on this that actually started the war?
Well, tensions had been building up for months in Spain. As I said earlier on, it was very much divided. The Spanish government had the support of a lot of the Spanish peasants, the poor. The Spanish government had brought in a lot of reforms that took away some of the power of the Catholic Church, the Spanish army, and some of the wealthy landowners. These tensions had been boiling up for months, and there had been churches had been burned. So some people say that perhaps some sort of confrontation was inevitable, but the spark was Franco. And like I said, he launched the coup in North Africa, and it probably wouldn't have been successful without the help of Hitler's Air Force that transported his soldiers, the Army of Africa and the Spanish Foreign Legion, onto mainland Spain.
Is that why people often, historians, refer to this as the kind of tune-up for World War II?
Yeah, and a lot of the veterans of the Spanish Civil War, especially the Canadians who several months later joined the war on the side of the Spanish government, they'll in fact go even further and say it wasn't just a tune-up for World War II, it was a dress rehearsal or even the first battle of the Second World War.
One of the most famous paintings, even people who don't know much about the Spanish Civil War have probably heard of the painting Guernica by Picasso, and it was meant to memorialize the fascists' aerial bombing of this northern city of Guernica. Why was that such a memorable attack?
Oh, well, it's a horrible and a beautiful painting all at once. What it does is it captured one of the first examples of terror bombing of a civilian targets in Europe. And Guernica, I mean, it wasn't the first. Actually, there was a Canadian, one of the first Canadians to fight in Spain by chance, happened to be in Durango about a month earlier on. And that town was bombed as well. But Guernica was a holy city to the Basques, and of course it was immortalized by Pablo Picasso. So it really captured this new era of warfare where civilians were targets as well, and it really kind of was a warning of what was to come in the Second World War.
I want to now move our discussion to the story of Canada, because 1,700 Canadians went over there to fight in this Spanish Civil War, obviously almost all of them on the side of the Republicans. And I guess it was back in 2001 that there was a ceremony, a commemorative ceremony, in this country, and one of the people who took part in those battles back in the 1930s was there, Jules Pavio. And let's hear a little piece of tape from him, and then we'll come back and talk. Go ahead, Michael, roll tape.
What was it that about the first war against fascism that so motivated us? We were ordinary people of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds, but people whose sense of social justice had been shaped by the conditions of the time. The Great Depression, the massive unemployment, the Dust Bowl, devastating prairie farms, the lack of any social safety net.
Michael, just follow up on those explanations there, because I think Jules brilliantly describes why people went over there, but it may be difficult for some people to understand. It's one thing to volunteer to go fight to defend your own country. These people were going to volunteer to fight for a country that they had no particular connection to. Why did they do it?
Well, I think Jules hits the nail on the head. These were young Canadians, or some of them are even in their 30s and 40s, and they were living through crushing times here in Canada. I mean, the Great Depression, I think it's hard for us to imagine today what it was like then, but a lot of these guys were recent immigrants. They had come to Canada in the 1920s full of hope and promises of what they thought their new life in Canada would be. And they had been here a few years without any time to really put down roots, and then, bam, they're hit by the Great Depression, which was just a devastating time in Canada for recent immigrants and even for people that had been here for generations. So you had hundreds and thousands of young unemployed men who were crisscrossing back and forth across the prairies on the roofs of boxcars, sleeping in flop houses, or a lot of them were working in these relief camps. These were camps that were established by Prime Minister Bennett in the Canadian hinterland. They're essentially make-work projects. The idea was to get the young and potentially radical unemployed young men away from the cities, away from polite society, and subdue the subversives, as it were. Of course, the opposite happened in these camps. A lot of them became very radicalized. One volunteer, he described it this way. He said, we couldn't see anything except blackness in front of us. All we saw were these camps. And this is why a lot of these guys, they became radicalized. Many of them joined the Communist Party. And they saw in Spain, even though you're right, these Canadians weren't of Spanish background, but they saw the Civil War in Spain, the battle in Spain, as part of a much larger global struggle between the left and the right, between liberals, Democrats against fascism. So even though it was a Spanish Civil War, they saw it as part of a struggle that involved them as well, and that mattered to them even here in Canada.
How much did they actually know about soldiering before they went over there?
Tragically little. And they learned tragically little about soldiering in Spain before they actually had to face enemy guns as well. These guys were not professional soldiers. A lot of them were veterans of these relief camps, as I said. Their experience was in farming. Some of them had been in the First World War, had served in various armies in the First World War, and a few in some of the civil wars that flared up after World War I, some of the attempted revolutions. Many of the Irish immigrants had been in the IRA, but these weren't professional soldiers. And they went over there. A lot of them weren't even properly equipped. Many of them climbed the Pyrenees Mountains from France into Spain, wearing city shoes that were just cut to ribbons. Then they enlisted, and their training, in some cases, famously involved, on their way to the front, the trucks would pull over to the side of the road, and they would be handed their rifles and their cartridges and told to fire 5 shots at a scrap of cloth on a nearby hillside. So they really weren't trained or equipped well, and this had tragic results for the Canadians in Spain during the battle.
Well, 1,700 went over, and what, 400 didn't come back, right?
More than 400 died at least, and I suspect it was more than that. I mean, I've done years and years of careful research, and I've tried to track down what happened to as many people as I could, but records just don't exist for many of them, so at least 400 died. Just horrendous casualty rates.
I want to read an excerpt of your book here and then ask a question emerging from that. What did the International Brigades and the Canadians who fought in its ranks actually accomplish, you ask? It is a difficult question and a painful one for many veterans. We didn't accomplish what we started out to do, Ron Liversedge said 30 years after the war. On one level, Liversedge is unavoidably correct. Despite the sacrifices of thousands of internationals and tens of thousands of Spaniards, The Spanish Republic lost the war. The democratic world failed to rally behind the Spanish Republic. The Canadians, who recognized the danger of fascism and volunteered to fight it, were abandoned and ultimately defeated. Those who did so can claim only a moral victory, the belief that even lost causes can be worthwhile. I want to know, Michael, first of all, the people who went over there were not really attached initially to any particular unit, but eventually they become part of what became the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion, the MacPaps. How did all that happen?
Well, the Canadians who first went to Spain, many of them joined the American battalions, the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and the George Washington Battalion. These battalions were combined into one because of the horrendous casualty rates that the Americans suffered as well. But the Canadians began agitating all through the spring and early summer of 1937, saying, look, hundreds of us are over here, we're fighting, we're proud of where we come from, and they wanted to have a Canadian-named battalion as well. So July 1937, on or around Dominion Day, the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion was formed, named after the 1837 rebels. And many of the Canadians, about half, ended up fighting in the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. Some Americans fought with the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion as well, and some Canadians stuck with the American battalions. And other Canadians served in other units. A lot of them, as I said, were recent immigrants, and some of them served in Hungarian or Polish units. But then at the end of the war, as all the Canadians were gathered in one place waiting to go back to Canada, they all collectively took on the identity as the MacPaps, regardless of the specific unit in which they had fought during the course of the fighting.
You mentioned earlier that Hitler and Mussolini were influential on the fascist side of the Civil War. How about the Soviet Union? Was it influential with the Republican side?
Certainly. I mean, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people say it was a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. What happened when the war broke out? The Spanish Republic wanted help from its fellow democracies, France, United States, Canada, Great Britain, and it didn't get it. The only country that helped Spain was the Soviet Union. And this had an enormous effect on Spanish politics. The Soviet Union sent a lot of military assistance to Spain, paid for, it must be noted, with Spanish gold reserves. This was not a gift. It was the military hardware was bought. So the influence of the Soviet Union in the Spanish Republic increased steadily throughout the course of the war. So Soviet military assistance did have a large effect on the Spanish Republic. This is where they got a lot of their tanks and their planes. And of course, as you mentioned, on the other side, Mussolini, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany armed Franco. So it was kind of it was like a Second World War in miniature, with two of the major combatants of the Second World War almost using Spain as a proxy battleground for the epic confrontation to come.
And how about back here in Canada? How much public and/or political, as in government support, for the 1700 was there back here for them?
Well, the Canadian public was very divided. I mean, there were people that were very much in favor of these guys that were going over to fight in Spain. Norman Bethune, one of the most famous Canadians to serve, he was a doctor, pioneered blood transfusion technology during the siege on Madrid. When he came back on publicity tours, he spoke to overflowing speaking halls and drew enormous crowds. The Canadian government, and especially the RCMP, however, were very disturbed by what was happening. It was the view of the RCMP, the fear of the RCMP, that these Canadians would go to Spain and would learn about revolutionary warfare and would come back and apply these lessons to Canada. So they were very disturbed about this and continually pushed the Canadian government to start legal action against the recruiters and the volunteers. Although there's a wonderfully revealing quote from the RCMP commissioner at the time. He's referring to the volunteers and he says, "We are getting rid of a lot of undesirables who may never return, but laws should be enforced if possible." So the RCMP did see a silver lining to these Canadians going over to Spain. On the one hand, they might learn revolutionary warfare and bring this back to Canada. On the other hand, they might not come back.
Well, you know, when they did come back, those who did return, they were not exactly welcomed home as heroes of a great war off in the far away regions of the world. In fact, just the opposite. And it took, I guess, about 6 decades before this country recognized the contribution of these fighters. I want to play another piece of tape here. Here is then Governor General Adrian Clarkson in the year 2001 acknowledging the contribution these men made to the world at that time. Roll tape, please.
The Mac-Paps decided that this cause was important enough for them to face the anger of their own government, to face the consternation of many of their fellow citizens at that time and for decades to come, and to face a life afterwards in which very few people would take the least interest in the kind of idealism that had sent them to Spain in the first place. Because they were fighting for an ideal. They were fighting against fascism, which was like a rehearsal for the war to come. These men of the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion of the 15th International Brigade of the Spanish Republican Army gave a passionate attachment to a civil war a half a world away.
You talked to a number of these veterans, Michael, and I'm wondering whether any of them, obviously hindsight being 2020, ever regretted fighting on the same side as Joseph Stalin's Russia?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Canadians, about 3/4 of them were communists. I know this from going through the recently declassified records from the Soviet Union. Although it's interesting that when you're reading the evaluations made by European communists and these usually American or European commanders who had the higher up positions in Spain, when they're evaluating the Canadians, time and time again they say things like, these Canadians are very brave soldiers, they're very good at the front, but they're, quote, politically undeveloped. They weren't as dogmatic communists as many of their political leaders there wanted them to be. We see this also when the Second World War broke out, as many people will know. In 1939, it was a view of the Soviet Union, and therefore of all good communists, that this was an imperialist war, and communists should have nothing to do with it. But the Canadian veterans of Spain, even though they were about 3/4 communists, many of them immediately tried to enlist in the Canadian Army. They thought we'd been fighting Hitler 6 months ago, we're not through yet. So they weren't that dogmatic, but yes, many of them were communists, and certainly some of them were Stalinists as well, it must be said. So some did have second thoughts at the time. Many had second thoughts when the details of Stalin's crimes were revealed in the 1950s. And very few stayed dogmatic Soviet admirers into the 70s and 80s. But there were a few. Certainly there are a few that did express regret about fighting in a largely communist army, and did even, one gentleman even had second thoughts about what might have happened had the Spanish Republic won, and he worried that perhaps the Civil War would continue within Republican ranks between communists and socialists and liberals. But the vast majority of the Canadian volunteers are extremely proud of what they did. One fellow said, you know, it's the only decent thing I ever did in my life as an adult. It was a time when the experiences of youth and idealism and war really intensified what happened in their minds. And I think for the majority of Canadians who did fight in Spain, they're proud of what they did.
You hit on an interesting notion there in the middle of that answer, and I want to follow up on that because, and admittedly, we're into the realm of pure speculation here, but there are other historians who say that if the efforts to stop fascism in Spain had been more successful and the Republicans had in fact won, it might have emboldened the Soviet Union not to stop there, but rather to have further designs on Western Europe, and the Second World War might have been completely different, and the ending of it might have been completely different as well.
Certainly.
Is there, you know, I don't know how far you want to push that, but is that a legitimate concern?
Well, I mean, historians, counterfactual historians, people that like to explore what-ifs, are divided. I mean, some people say, look, if you know, only the democracy that has Spain's fellow democracies had taken a stand in Spain, the Second World War could have been stopped, Hitler could have been stopped, millions of lives could have been saved. And of course, on the other side, there are people that say, well, hold on a second, if the Republic had won, it would have been a Soviet satellite, and who knows what would have happened. I think what's important to point out is when the war began in 1936, the influence of the Soviet Union in Spain was quite small. That influence grew because, as I argue in my book, Spain's natural allies, its fellow democracies, abandoned it. They sacrificed Spain ultimately in a vain attempt, an unsuccessful attempt to appease European fascism. So I mean, I can't know, and none of us can know how things would have played out if other countries had gotten involved earlier, if the Republic had have won. But I do think that as a democracy, Canada and Britain and the United States and France did have a moral obligation to support Spain, a democracy in 1936, and they failed that obligation.
With the exception of 1,700 brave souls.
True. Who were vilified by, certainly vilified and denigrated by their government.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I want to know, all these many years later, whether in your view, the Canadian government, the Canadian military, the Canadian public for that matter, have had a satisfactory, an adequate change of heart about the contribution that these 1,700 played in the history of fighting fascism around the world.
Well, the relationship with the Canadian veterans of Spain to the Canadian Army is an interesting one. Many of them were not allowed to enlist in the Second World War because of their Spanish connections, but some of them, many of them did actually, and some of them were given very dangerous assignments as part of the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, to parachute behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. So on the one hand, some of these Canadian veterans were not allowed to enlist in the Canadian Army. On the other hand, they were given the most important and dangerous assignments. But I think more importantly, the RCMP continued to spy on Canadian veterans of Spain for decades after the war. The most recent surveillance report that I've been able to find dates from 1984. This is almost 50 years after the Spanish Civil War ended. So the RCMP certainly bore a grudge about the Canadian veterans, bore a grudge towards the Canadian veterans of Spain for long after it made any sense. As for the greater Canadian public, I mean, look, I think this is an important part of our history that I wish more people knew about, and I hope my book will bring that story to people. And, you know, I mean, for me, the bottom line is, despite the complexities of the war, and again, I don't want to gloss this over, wars are ugly and civil wars are particularly nasty affairs. But the Canadians who fought in Spain, they had the moral clarity to take a stand against fascism, against a fascism that was rising and becoming more powerful in Europe, when the rest of their country decided to look away or to appease this threat. And I think that is their legacy, and that's what I hope people take from the war today.
Michael, it was a terrific read, and I want to thank you very much for writing the book and for joining us tonight to talk about it.
Nice
Michael
to talk to you,
Petrou, Renegades, Canadians in the Spanish Civil War. Good to see you again, Michael. Be well.
Thanks, Steve.